"You can pay for the wedding, Mom, but you won't be sitting in the front row." Those were the words my daughter said to me 3 days before her wedding. And for a moment, I honestly thought I had misheard her. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and until that moment, I believed there was no pain greater than losing my husband 12 years ago. I was wrong. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from the people you spent your entire life loving. The morning of Sophie's wedding began like something from a magazine. The sky above Charleston was clear and bright. The air carried the scent of fresh roses, and guests filled the historic church with laughter and excitement. I arrived early, dressed in a pale blue dress that had taken me weeks to choose. I wanted to look elegant, but not draw attention away from my daughter. After all, this was supposed to be her day. For nearly a year, I had helped make that day possible. Every centerpiece, every floral arrangement, every place setting, every musician performing during the reception represented a check I had written or a bill I had quietly paid. My retirement account was smaller now than I ever planned, but whenever Sophie thanked me and wrapped her arms around me, I convinced myself it was worth it. Family was worth it. At least that's what I kept telling myself. As I stepped into the church foyer, I noticed a large seating chart displayed on an easel near the entrance. Guests were gathering around it, smiling as they searched for their names. I wasn't concerned about where I would sit. Why would I be? I was the bride's mother. Then I found my name. Eleanor Whitmore. Row 4. Seat 7. I stared at it for several seconds. Surely it was a mistake. The front row contained Ryan's parents, his aunt and uncle, and 2 elderly relatives I had never even met. The second and third rows were reserved for extended family and close friends. My name sat behind all of them. For rows away from the daughter I had raised by myself after my husband passed away. For rows away from the child whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose college tuition I had helped pay, whose wedding I was helping fund. A young usher approached me politely. "Mrs. Whitmore, is everything okay?" I forced a smile and nodded. Of course. But inside, something felt terribly wrong. Then I heard Sophie's voice behind me. Cheerful, casual, unbothered. "Mom, there you are." I turned toward her, hoping she would laugh and tell me the seating chart had been printed incorrectly. Instead, she glanced at it and smiled. "Oh good, they fixed it." That was the moment I realized my seat wasn't a mistake at all. It was exactly where my daughter wanted me to be. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking at Sophie. Around us, guests continued chatting, ushers guided people toward their seats, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. To everyone else, it was a beautiful wedding morning. To me, it felt as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted. "Fixed it?" I asked quietly. Sophie adjusted a loose strand of hair and nodded. "Yes, Ryan and I spent a lot of time organizing the seating. We wanted the front rows reserved for people who would be in the wedding photos." Her tone was light, almost cheerful, as if she were discussing flower arrangements instead of explaining why her own mother had been pushed aside. I looked at her, searching for some sign of discomfort, some hint that she understood how painful her words were. I found none. "I see," I said. Sophie smiled. "I knew you would understand." Then she hurried away before I could say anything else. I remained beside the seating chart for another moment before walking toward my assigned seat. Row 4. Seat 7. Every step felt heavier than the one before it. As I sat down, I found myself remembering the months leading up to this day. It had started almost a year earlier when Sophie announced her engagement during a family dinner. She had been glowing with excitement, and I had been genuinely happy for her. Ryan seemed polite, successful, and ambitious. Most importantly, he appeared to love my daughter. When discussions about the wedding began, Sophie often came to my house carrying notebooks, fabric samples, and venue brochures. We spent countless afternoons sitting at my kitchen table drinking tea and planning every detail. At first, she insisted she would keep the wedding modest. That promise lasted less than a month. Soon there was a larger venue, then a premium catering package, then custom floral installations, then a live band. Each upgrade came with the same nervous smile and the same familiar sentence. "Mom, I hate asking, but could you help just a little more?" And every time, I said yes. I withdrew money from savings accounts I had spent decades building. I postponed home repairs. I canceled a trip I had planned with friends. Whenever doubt appeared, I reminded myself that this was my daughter's wedding. Some moments happen only once. Looking back now, I realized something else was changing during those months. Sophie stopped asking for my opinion. She only asked for my help. There is a difference between the two. At the time, I was too focused on making her happy to notice it. A burst of laughter from the front rows pulled me back to the present. Ryan's family filled the seats closest to the altar. They looked comfortable there, as if those places had always belonged to them. I glanced around the church and noticed several guests quietly looking in my direction. Their expressions carried a mixture of confusion and sympathy. That was when a painful thought entered my mind. If strangers could see something was wrong, then this was much bigger than a seating arrangement. The ceremony had not started yet, but I suddenly felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap while guests continued arriving around me. The church filled with conversations, camera flashes, and the soft sound of music drifting from the organ. Nobody said anything directly to me, yet I could feel people noticing. A mother of the bride sitting 4 rows back was not something people expected to see. I tried focusing on the stained glass windows instead of the growing ache in my chest. The colored light painted the wooden pews in shades of blue and gold, and for a moment I remembered another church many years earlier. Sophie was 8 years old. She had stood beside me during a Christmas service, clutching my hand and refusing to let go. Back then, I was her entire world. The memory made me smile sadly. Somewhere along the way, that little girl had disappeared. As guests continued finding their seats, more pieces of the past began fitting together. Moments I had dismissed, conversations I had ignored, small incidents that had seemed harmless at the time. About 6 months earlier, Sophie had invited me to meet with the wedding planner, Vanessa Cole. I arrived carrying a notebook full of ideas and questions. I thought we would be making decisions together. Instead, most of the meeting consisted of Sophie and Ryan discussing details, while Vanessa directed nearly every question toward them. Whenever I offered a suggestion, Sophie smiled politely and changed the subject. At the time, I told myself it was normal. Young couples wanted control over their wedding day. Then there was the tasting event at the reception venue. Sophie had originally asked me to attend. The night before, she called and said there was limited space and that Ryan's parents would be going instead. I remember feeling disappointed, but I quickly buried the feeling. There would be plenty of other opportunities to participate. Or so I thought. A few weeks later came the bridal shower. Once again, I found myself sitting at a distant table while Ryan's family occupied the center of the room. Even then, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Looking back, I realized I had spent months explaining away behavior that would have hurt anyone else. The truth was uncomfortable. Every time Sophie needed financial help, I was included. Every time an important decision was made, I was pushed farther away. The pattern seemed obvious now. I simply had not wanted to see it. Suddenly, someone slid into the empty seat beside me. I turned and saw Judith Harper, my closest friend for more than 20 years. She had attended every major moment of my life since my husband passed away. One glance at her face told me she already understood something was wrong. She squeezed my hand gently and leaned closer. "Eleanor," she whispered, "there is something I think you need to know before this ceremony starts." The seriousness in her voice immediately caught my attention, and for the first time that day, I felt a different emotion replacing the hurt. Concern. Judith rarely sounded alarmed. During the 22 years I had known her, she had always been the calm one, the person who could steady a room simply by walking into it. That was why the tension in her voice immediately caught my attention. I turned toward her and saw something unusual in her expression. It was not pity. It was disappointment. "What is it?" I asked quietly. Judith glanced toward the front rows where Ryan's family was gathering. Then she lowered her voice. "I was not planning to tell you this today. I hoped I was wrong." My stomach tightened. Wrong about what? For a moment she hesitated. Then she said something that made my heart sink even further. "I overheard a conversation during the rehearsal dinner last night." The words settled heavily between us. I remembered declining the rehearsal dinner invitation because Sophie had explained there were space limitations. Apparently, there had been room for dozens of other guests. Just not for me. Judith continued carefully. "I was standing near the terrace when Ryan's cousin asked why you were not sitting with the immediate family during the ceremony. I looked down at my hands. Somehow I already knew I was not going to like the answer. And what did they say?" Judith sighed softly. Ryan laughed and said the front rows should be reserved for people who are actually part of their future. I stared at her. "Their future?" She nodded. Then someone joked that at least you were paying for enough of the wedding to earn a seat somewhere in the building. For a moment I could not speak. The music from the organ continued drifting through the church, but it suddenly felt very far away. What did Sophie say? I finally asked. Judith looked away before answering. That single movement told me everything. She did not defend you. I closed my eyes briefly. The silence hurt more than any insult could have. If a stranger had spoken badly about me, I could have ignored it. If Ryan had made a careless joke, I could have dismissed it. But Sophie's silence was different. Silence can reveal agreement more clearly than words. I thought back to the countless evenings spent helping her plan this wedding. The long phone calls, the meetings, the checks I had written without hesitation. Every time she thanked me, I believed we were building something together. Now I wondered whether she had simply been accepting my help while quietly deciding how little space I deserved in her life. Judith gently touched my arm. There is something else. I looked at her again. Last night, I heard Ryan say that once the wedding was over, they would finally be able to stop pretending. A chill moved through me. Pretending what? Judith's expression darkened. Pretending they needed anyone's approval. The church doors opened near the back, and several guests turned toward the entrance. The ceremony would begin soon. Around me, excitement filled the room. Smiles, laughter, anticipation. Yet all I could think about was one painful realization. This was no longer about a seat. It was about discovering that the role I believed I held in my daughter's life might never have existed at all. For the first time that morning, I stopped looking toward the altar and started looking inward. There is a moment when disappointment becomes clarity. It does not arrive with shouting or tears. It arrives quietly, like sunlight revealing dust that has been floating in the air all along. As guests settled into their seats, I replayed the past year in my mind. Every conversation, every request, every promise. I remembered Sophie calling me late one evening, her voice trembling as she worried about the rising costs of the reception. I had reassured her that everything would work out. The next morning, I transferred another portion of my savings without hesitation. I remembered driving 40 miles to meet vendors she wanted to impress. I remembered spending entire weekends reviewing contracts and comparing prices because she said she trusted my judgment. Yet somewhere between those moments and this one, trust had been replaced by convenience. The realization hurt, but it also brought an unexpected sense of calm. A person can only be disappointed when expectations still exist. Mine were beginning to disappear. Judith remained beside me, quietly respecting my silence. After several minutes, she spoke again. You do not deserve this, Eleanor. I smiled faintly. Maybe I should have noticed sooner. She shook her head. Good people always notice last. They assume everyone else has the same heart they do. Her words stayed with me. Good people notice last. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps I had spent so many years trying to be understanding that I had overlooked what was happening directly in front of me. Across the aisle, I spotted Sophie speaking with several bridesmaids. She looked radiant, confident, and completely at ease. Not once did she glance toward row 4. Not once did she appear concerned about whether I was comfortable or hurt. I found that more revealing than anything Judith had told me. People reveal their priorities through attention. The things they value receive their focus. The things they take for granted fade into the background. I wondered when I had become part of the background. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 2 months earlier, Sophie had asked me to meet her for lunch. I arrived thinking she wanted to spend time together. Instead, she spent most of the meal discussing upgraded decorations and additional expenses. When the check arrived, she smiled and said, "I knew you would understand." At the time, I thought she was thanking me for my generosity. Now I realized she may have been thanking me for my predictability. She always knew I would say yes. The church grew quieter as the ceremony start time approached. The organist began playing a slower melody. Guests straightened in their seats. Anticipation filled the room. I took a deep breath and folded my hands once more. The sadness was still there, but something else had joined it. Resolve. Not anger. Not revenge. Resolve. Because for the first time all year, I stopped asking what I could do for Sophie and started asking a different question entirely. What would happen when I finally stopped saying yes? As that question settled into my mind, the church doors closed and the ceremony began. Everyone stood. I rose with the rest of the guests and watched as the bridal party entered one by one. The organ filled the sanctuary with music that should have felt joyful. Instead, I found myself observing everything with unusual clarity. It was as though a veil had been lifted. For months, I had viewed every decision through the eyes of a mother eager to support her daughter. Now I was seeing the same events through a different lens. The difference was startling. Sophie appeared at the end of the aisle, beautiful and confident in the gown I had helped pay for. Guests smiled. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. I felt proud of her despite everything. That was the strange thing about being a parent. Love does not disappear simply because disappointment arrives. The two often sit side by side. As Sophie walked toward the altar, she never once looked in my direction. Her attention remained fixed on Ryan. I told myself that was normal. Brides focus on the future standing in front of them. Yet part of me wondered whether she had spent so long looking ahead that she no longer saw the people behind her. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. I listened to promises about commitment, trust, gratitude, and partnership. Certain words lingered in my mind longer than others. Gratitude, respect, loyalty. They sounded beautiful when spoken aloud. I wondered how often people truly practiced them. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the church. Guests began making their way toward the reception venue overlooking the Charleston harbor. Judith stayed close beside me. Neither of us said much during the drive. Some truths require silence before they can be fully understood. The reception hall was stunning. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across the room. Fresh flowers covered nearly every table. The waterfront view stretched for miles. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of the countless invoices I had paid. Yet something had changed inside me. Earlier, those expenses represented sacrifices made out of love. Now they looked more like lessons purchased at a very high price. During cocktail hour, I found a quiet corner near the windows and watched guests mingle. Several people approached to compliment the wedding. Others thanked me for helping create such a beautiful celebration. Their kindness touched me more than they probably realized. Then I overheard a conversation that confirmed what Judith had told me. Two distant relatives of Ryan were standing nearby. They did not notice me. One of them laughed and said, "Ryan got lucky. Her mother covered half the wedding and still stayed out of the way." The other replied, "That is probably exactly how they wanted it." Neither statement was particularly loud. Neither was intended for me. Yet hearing those words felt like hearing an uncomfortable truth spoken openly for the first time. I quietly turned toward the harbor outside the window. Boats drifted across the water beneath the late afternoon sun. The view was peaceful, steady, unbothered by human disappointments. And standing there, I made a decision. I could not change what had happened today. I could not force respect from people who no longer valued what I gave them. But I could change what happened next. For the first time in many years, I was ready to stop confusing generosity with obligation. As evening settled over the harbor, the reception moved into its next phase. Guests found their seats, servers carried elegant plates through the room, and conversations blended into a pleasant hum beneath the music. From a distance, everything appeared perfect. That was the remarkable thing about appearances. They often survived long after the truth had started falling apart. I remained calm, not because I was unaffected, but because I had spent enough years learning that emotions make poor guides during important moments. Instead of reacting, I observed. Sophie moved from table to table greeting guests. Ryan laughed easily with friends and relatives. Every so often, someone approached me to thank me for helping make the celebration possible. Their words were sincere. Unlike many things I had heard that day, their gratitude felt genuine. During dinner, the wedding planner, Vanessa Cole, stopped by my table. She smiled warmly and thanked me for being so easy to work with throughout the planning process. Then she said something unexpected. "I have never seen a parent contribute so much and ask for so little." The statement lingered in my mind long after she walked away. Ask for so little. She was right. I had never asked for recognition. I had never asked for praise. I had only expected basic respect. Somewhere along the way, even that had become negotiable. As dessert was served, Sophie finally approached my table. It was one of the longest conversations we had shared all day. She looked happy, relaxed, and completely unaware of the distance that had grown between us. "Mom, everything turned out beautifully," she said. "I told you it would." I smiled politely. "Yes, it did." She glanced around the room proudly. "People are going to remember this wedding for years." There was a time when I would have agreed immediately. Instead, I found myself studying her expression. She looked satisfied, accomplished. victorious, even. Not because she had married the man she loved, but because everything had gone according to plan. Every detail had landed exactly where she wanted it, including me. "I am glad you are happy," I said. Sophie nodded and prepared to move on to another table. Then she paused. "By the way, thank you again for all your help. We could not have done this without you." Under different circumstances, those words might have healed something. Tonight they felt strangely hollow, because gratitude means very little when it appears only after everything has been received. After she walked away, I looked around the ballroom one more time. The flowers, the music, the decorations, the expensive waterfront venue. All of it represented a chapter that was ending. Not my relationship with my daughter. Something deeper. The belief that love required unlimited sacrifice. The belief that saying no made someone selfish. The belief that being needed was the same thing as being valued. As applause erupted for the newlyweds preparing for their first dance, I quietly reached a decision that felt both painful and liberating. Nothing would change tonight. I would not create a scene. I would not argue. I would not defend myself. But when this celebration ended, the version of Eleanor Whitmore that always said yes would be staying behind with it. The reception continued late into the evening. The dance floor remained crowded, laughter echoed across the ballroom, and glasses were raised in celebration. From the outside, it looked like a perfect ending to a perfect day. Yet I had learned something important over the years. The most revealing moments often happen after people believe the important part is over. Shortly after the first dance, guests began sharing stories about the bride and groom. Friends spoke about college memories. Family members recalled holidays and milestones. One by one, people stood and offered warm words filled with affection and encouragement. Then Ryan's father was invited to speak. He received enthusiastic applause as he walked to the microphone. He spoke about family, sacrifice, and the people who helped shape a couple's future. As I listened, I noticed something curious. He thanked nearly everyone involved in the wedding. The planner, the venue staff, the bridal party, several relatives. Yet my name never appeared once. I felt no anger, only confirmation. Some truths no longer needed proving. A little later, one of Sophie's bridesmaids approached my table. She looked nervous. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, "I just wanted to tell you something." I smiled and invited her to sit down. She hesitated before speaking. "A lot of us thought it was strange that you were seated so far back at the ceremony. We assumed it had to be some kind of mistake." I thanked her for her honesty. She glanced toward the head table. "For what it is worth, everyone knows how much you did for this wedding." Her words were simple, but they carried more sincerity than many of the formal speeches that evening. After she left, I sat quietly and reflected on everything that had happened. The humiliation I felt that morning had slowly transformed into understanding. Not understanding of their choices, understanding of my own value. There is a difference. For too long, I had measured my place in other people's lives by how much I could give. Money, time, energy, support. The more I provided, the more secure I believed the relationship became. But real respect does not grow from transactions. It grows from character. Near the end of the evening, Sophie finally returned to my table once again. She looked tired but pleased with how the day had unfolded. "Mom," she said, "thank you for being so supportive through everything." I looked at her carefully. For the first time all day, I saw not a bride or a daughter, but an adult responsible for her own choices. "You are welcome," I replied calmly. Then I added something I had not planned to say. "I hope one day you understand the difference between being appreciated and being used." Her smile faded slightly. Confusion crossed her face. Before she could respond, another guest called her name from across the room. She excused herself and walked away. I watched her disappear into the crowd, wondering if my words would stay with her. Something told me they would, because sometimes the quietest truths are the ones people remember longest. The wedding ended, but the lesson stayed with me. In the weeks that followed, life became quiet again. The flowers wilted. The photographs were posted online. The thank you cards were mailed. Like every celebration, it eventually became a memory. Yet I found myself thinking less about the ceremony and more about what it had revealed. For years, I had believed that love meant always being available, always helping, always giving. If someone I cared about needed support, I provided it without hesitation. I wore that habit like a badge of honor. What I did not realize was that somewhere along the way, I had stopped asking whether the people around me valued me or simply valued what I could provide. About 2 months after the wedding, Sophie called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded different, softer, less certain. We exchanged a few polite words before a long silence settled between us. Finally, she asked a question I had not expected. "Mom, are you upset with me?" I stood by my kitchen window and looked out at the small garden my husband and I had planted years earlier. The roses were blooming again. Seasons have a way of reminding us that growth often follows uncomfortable change. I was hurt, I answered honestly. There is a difference. Another silence followed. This one lasted longer. I did not realize how it looked, she said quietly. I could have argued. I could have listed every detail, every slight, every disappointment. Instead, I simply told her the truth. The seat was not the real issue, Sophie. She did not respond immediately. Then what was? I took a slow breath, feeling valued only when I was needed. Those words seemed to land somewhere deeper than anything I could have said on the wedding day. For the first time, she listened instead of defending herself. Over the following months, our relationship changed. Not overnight. Not magically. Real healing rarely works that way. There were difficult conversations. Honest conversations. Conversations we should have had years earlier. For her part, Sophie gradually began acknowledging things she had never noticed before. For mine, I learned something equally important. Boundaries are not punishments. They are acts of self-respect. I stopped offering help before it was requested. I stopped assuming responsibility for problems that were not mine to solve. Most importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to other people. One afternoon nearly a year later, Sophie invited me to lunch. As we sat together, she looked at me and smiled. "You seem happier lately." I smiled back. "I am." And I meant it. Because happiness had returned the moment I stopped chasing approval and started valuing myself. Looking back now, I no longer think about where I sat that day. The front row was never the real issue. Respect was. The wedding did not teach me that my daughter was imperfect. I already knew that. It taught me that I deserved the same kindness, consideration, and appreciation that I had spent a lifetime giving to others. And once I learned that lesson, I gained something far more valuable than a seat in the front row. I gained my place in my own life.